From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Frances Steed Sellers. I'm a senior editor at the Washington Post, which is one of the original sponsors of this event, and I'm very glad to see you here. So it's with enormous pleasure that I introduce Charlie Kupchan this afternoon to speak to you about his latest book, No One's World, The West, The Rising Rest, and the Coming Global Turn. This provocative and I think prescient book about the emergence of a new global This is a provocative and I think prescient book about the emergence of a global ideological marketplace, in which Charlie argues that America has to prepare to fight not only for its own interests, but for its values. And here's why. We're at a pivotal moment, or global turn, he says, in which the international order that we've known for more than 50 years is giving way to be replaced by something entirely new, in which we can no longer believe in the universality of the American way. With new forms of governance and capitalism arriving in China and other rising nations, America will have to learn to forge consensus in an increasingly unwieldy and unwelcoming world. All of which makes me look across the mall here and hope that our legislators and foreign policy experts are paying attention. Because the world Charlie describes is one that not only no longer plays by Washington's rules, it's one in which the West no longer anchors globalization. Effective global governance, he says, will require forging common ground amid a new distribution of power and rising ideological diversity. But before I pass over to Charlie, let me tell you a couple of things about him himself. It's a great pleasure to welcome a local author and somebody I've known for a very long time. This Big Think book arrived at a pivotal moment in Charlie's own life. Sitting here in the front row is his daughter Maya, and I believe she arrived on the same day that he had to attend a book event in New York. He managed both, because Charlie's never one to give up on challenges. Another quick story I must tell you. About 20 years ago, Charlie, my husband, and a mutual friend ran the Boston Marathon together. Charlie finished a little after the others and a little tired, but I bundled them all into the car, and we headed off to the mutual friend's house where my husband and he began celebrating with shots of vodka. When Charlie began to look a little pale and spoke a little less coherently than I think he will later on today, we worried a little bit, but did I dial 911? I'm afraid not. I gave him a cup of tea and a shot of vodka. And Google what to do with somebody with hypothermia. Don't give them caffeine or vodka. Anyway, you can understand my delight and actually relief to see Charlie here today. He is the Whitney Shepherdson Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a professor of International Affairs at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He's the author of several previous books and articles on international and strategic affairs, and he'll talk to us today about why the world of the future is no one's world. Welcome, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Frances, for the warm introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming out this afternoon. It's reassuring for those of us who toil away writing books that we're not doing so in vain, and that people actually occasionally read them, and maybe the ideas trickle down into broader debates about the United States and its role in the world. Just to set the record straight, that day in Boston it was raining and about 51, 52 degrees, and so I was fine as long as I was running, but then when I stopped running, my body temperature plunged. And Frances just casually treated this event, but I think she may have, I don't know if she saved my life, but she certainly wrapped me up in lots of blankets and plied me with all kinds of drinks, perhaps good ones as well as bad ones. But whatever you did worked, because we're both standing here today. If you took a snapshot of the world in the year, let's say 1700, you would see a world in which power was broadly diffused around the world. Here in North America, there really wasn't much economic or military capability, But across the Atlantic and across the Pacific, there was a great deal. And power was roughly equally distributed across 5 main imperial centers of power: the Holy Roman Empire in Europe, the Ottoman Empire in what is today Turkey, the Mughal Empire, present-day India, the Qing dynasty, contemporary China, and the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan. Each of these spheres had its own way of governing, its own cultural and political approach to commerce and to order. If you fast forward about 100, 120 years to the 19th century, the world had changed dramatically. Power had shifted from the West and the South to the North. And by 1815, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Europe had pulled ahead of the rest of the world. And the Industrial Revolution and the development of the steam engine and the development of steel and battleships and the telegraph and the underwater submarine cable enabled Europe not just to be the most powerful place in the world, but to extend its reach globally. And by the end of the 19th century, Europe had either colonized or had already decolonized 90% of the world's landmass. And we have been living in a world since 1815 dominated by the West, economically, politically, and ideologically. First it was Europe. Then Europe handed over the baton to the United States after Pearl Harbor. Pax Britannica morphed into Pax Americana. And roughly from 1815 until today, Europe, the United States, and I would tuck Japan in there because they've been part of the Western alliance system and the Western liberal democratic capitalist system since 1945. This section of the world has really been at the front of history. And what I'd like to suggest this afternoon, and what I write about in my book, is that the global order is starting to change again. The pendulum is swinging in a way that it hasn't swung since the 1700s. But this next global turn, this new swing of the pendulum, will be different than the last. Why? Because the last time the pendulum swung to the north and the west, and North America and Europe were at the head of history for the next several hundred years. Today, the pendulum is swinging everywhere and therefore nowhere. It's swinging to China, to India, to Brazil, to Turkey. The United States will do just fine in the 21st century, but so will a host of developing countries that have been behind the West for many years. And as a consequence, the 21st century will not be an American century. It will not be a Chinese century, an Asian century, an Indian century. It will be no one's world. It will be a world that for the first time in history will be integrated and globalized, smushed together, to use a technical term, but without the guardianship provided by the Western anchor. So what I'd like to do in the next 15 minutes or so is put some flesh on the bones, tell you why I think we are at the cusp of that historical intersection, and then end by saying a few things about what we as Americans should do about it. That the pendulum is swinging and power diffusing is, in my mind, unstoppable. And I'll just trot out a few facts and figures, and I'm drawing mainly on projections from the World Bank, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and from Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs likes to do studies of the future. The United States is today by far the most rich country in the world, but the Chinese are fast catching up. By 2027, the Chinese economy is supposed to have an aggregate GDP, global gross domestic product, equal to ours, and it will then pull ahead. By 2025, according to projections, we will live in a three-currency world: the dollar, the Chinese renminbi, and the euro, as long as the euro survives, which is looking somewhat more likely today, but I wouldn't bet a lot of money on it. And in perhaps the most stunning piece of information, we live in a world today in which 4 out of the 5 most wealthy countries are still Western. There is only one country that makes the cut into the top 5, and that is China, and they come in at number 2. In other words, this is still a world dominated by the West. Over the course of the next 3 to 4 decades, that pecking order will be completely changed. Of the top 5 countries in the world, only one Western country will make the cut in the year 2020, 2040, 2045, and that is the United States. And all the other top 5 countries will come from what is today the developing world. That this shift is occurring in the distribution of power is in some ways not that interesting. We know this happens. We know from history that power over time diffuses from the core to the periphery of the international system. I think the more interesting question is, what does it mean for the way the world will work? What does it mean for the order that we Americans and Europeans have collectively built, what's called the liberal international order of the 20th and the 21st century? Here, I think, is the interesting question. And there are 2 main views. I would say the dominant view, well represented in the building at the end of the mall and in the State Department at the other end of the mall, is the view that this shift in the distribution of power will not fundamentally change the world that we live in. Why? Because even though the West will lose its material prominence, its ideological primacy will last. Because the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, the Turks, and others will take their place in our order. They will dock in our harbor. In other words, the Western liberal order of capitalism, liberal democracy, and secular nationalism is about to be universalized. This is what Frank Fukuyama famously called the end of history about 20 years ago. I don't think it's going to be that easy. I think that by 2030, 2040, we will live in a world in which the West, in an ideological sense, finds itself only one of multiple versions of modernity that will have to compete in the marketplace of ideas, with state capitalism in Russia, China, and the Persian Gulf, with political Islam in the Middle East, with a left-wing brand of democratic populism in Latin America, and that our expectation that every country would actually converge and ultimately want to look like us will not prove to be accurate. Let me give you a sense as to why I think we are heading toward diversity rather than toward ideological convergence. In my mind, the rise of the West followed a unique political and social trajectory. We, as Americans, find our roots in the year 1100, when Europe began to fragment, when the 3 traditional institutions of authority, the monarchy, the nobility, and the Catholic Church, began to lose their stranglehold over society because a nascent bourgeoisie, blacksmiths, early bankers, early professionals began to push back against traditional society. And that middle class grew in size and strength and became the vanguard of the revolution that became the West. First bringing about religious pluralism through the Reformation, and then bringing about political pluralism, because monarchs said to the rising middle class, "We want your money to fight wars," and the middle class said, "Fine, you want our money, we have political voice." And it was that rise of middle class societies that gave rise to liberal democracy and that inoculated Americans and West Europeans against communism. Communism generally spread in poorer societies, in peasant societies, in working class societies. Middle class societies were stakeholders and attempted to follow a trajectory toward liberal democracy. Is that happening around the rest of the world today? Is China following a cultural and socioeconomic trajectory that will make China look like us 20, 30, 40 years from now? No. Why? What are some of the differences? Unlike the states of Europe that were dumb enough to try to push back against their middle class, China is doing exactly the opposite. It is embracing its middle class. It is making its middle class stakeholders in one-party rule. And that is one of the reasons that when you look at the stability of the Chinese government today, you see a likely prospect of continuation, not change. Because those individuals with the power to change the system don't want to change it because they are the main beneficiaries. And ever since Deng Xiaoping privatized the system and allowed businessmen to become party members and party members to become businessmen, state capitalism, a market economy married with one-party rule, has been enormously successful. And when we look at the world today and ask, is there a country out there that is actually performing reasonably well economically and politically and making relatively efficient decisions, the answer is yes. China's not doing a bad job. They're worried because they're slowing from 10% to 8% annual growth. We would be envious to have that kind of growth. I'm not saying that China is going to lead the next century. I'm not saying the Chinese system will be replicated around the world. I'm simply saying their version of modernity, state capitalism, has legs. It will be one way of organizing society for quite a long time. When I look at the Middle East, I say, yes, the Middle East does seem to be breaking our way. Participatory democracy is putting down roots. But there is a significant difference between what is happening in the Middle East today and our experience. And that fundamental difference has to do with the relationship between church and state, mosque and state, religion and politics. Our path to modernity went through the transformation of the Reformation. And after half of the German population died in the 30 Years' War, European diplomats forged the Peace of Westphalia, in which they basically said it is time to take religion and put it outside politics. And it took a long time to get there, but we live in a society today in which there is a legal constitutional separation of church and state. In most of the Middle East, there is no such separation. In the evolution of the Ottoman Empire and the Muslim Middle East, there was no emperor fighting with a pope because the caliph was both. Secular power and religious power were merged into one. And that is why participatory democracy in the Middle East is leading to a brand of democracy that is favoring political Islam, in which the mosque and the state are coming back together, being rejoined, because that is what the political culture in the Middle East wants. And in every country, with exception of Libya, in which there has been an election, parties favoring political Islam have been the beneficiaries. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm not saying, uh-oh, here come the Islamists. I'm saying it's a different way of thinking about how to organize political and commercial life. My guess is that Egypt, 10, 15 years from now, will be a stable democracy, but they will have a view of order, commerce, religion, and its relationship to politics that will look quite different from ours. Finally, take example of, say, India and Brazil, countries that are already liberal democracies and secular. They are as well following their own path to modernity, fashioned by the fact, in part, that they are still largely rural and urban poor societies, not middle-class societies. And there is an assumption in this country that because they are democratic states, they will side with us. Well, I think some days they will side with us, and other days they will side with other emerging powers. Turkey, Brazil, India, they are democratic powers, but when you look at voting in the UN, when you look at their position on Iran, when you look at their position on other issues, they, as often as not, side against the West rather than with the West. And that is a sense that we are moving to a world in which there will be great diversity as to how countries fashion their own versions of modernity and align themselves geopolitically. Let me begin to end by offering some thoughts on what we do about this. Moving to a world in which we are globalized and interdependent, but in which there is no single captain at the helm, is a world that provides great opportunities but also great risks. We have never lived in a world in which decisions made in Beijing immediately impact decisions made in Brussels, which immediately impact decisions here, which immediately impact decisions in Brasilia. We need to figure out how to manage that world, how to provide global governance in a world that is not only multipolar in the sense of multiple poles of power, but also quite ideologically diverse. And I will end simply with offering 3 thoughts on what we as Americans can do to try to prepare for that world. The first is get our own house in order. In the end of the day, America's strength abroad has always been grounded in its strength at home. And we are moving into a world in which we need to have our lights on, in which we need to be able to look out at the world and figure out what is coming around the curve. And I fear that right now, because of the slowdown in our economy and the polarization that has beset the building behind us, we're not ready to do that. And if one thinks back at the great age of American engagement in the world, really from Franklin Roosevelt through Bill Clinton, it rested upon a bipartisan compact between moderate and centrist Republicans and moderate and centrist Democrats. That sweet spot, that political center in American life is now in very bad shape. And we need to figure out how to breathe new life into it, because in many respects, our centrism, our reasonableness at home is the foundation for our ability to manage challenges abroad. And in my mind, the first order of business is to get our economy going again, and in particular, to restore the optimism and the prosperity of our middle class. That, in my mind, is what really gave life to the bipartisan centrism of the long era of the 20th century. That our middle class is at the losing end of our economic compact now is one of the reasons that ideological partisanship has come back to American political life. The second piece of advice I would give is that the United States should be careful, as a power that is going to have to focus on this big question of global governance and global order, of not getting distracted. And I fear that over the last 10, 15 years, we have tried to become the fixer of last resort, going into countries like Iraq and Afghanistan and trying to turn them into liberal democracies. It has proved to be a bridge too far. We need to keep our powder dry. We need to husband our resources. We need to focus on these big issues of the rise of China, the diversification of global order, and avoid getting bogged down in wars of choice that have a high likelihood of turning into black holes. The final point is that getting right this next era in global politics involves recognizing that it lies ahead. The United States will have more influence than any other country on shaping the 21st century, and that's because we will have an economy that is either number 1 or number 2 for the foreseeable future. We will have a military that is number 1 well into the 21st century, but we will not enjoy the influence that has come our way for the last 50 years, or 200 years if you include the dominance of Europe. But we need to see that that world is changing. If we stick our head in the sands and assume that the Western order will be universalized, I fear we will get it wrong. If we look around the curve and see that the world is diversifying, that the Western way is alive and well, but will be only one of multiple versions of how to organize political life in the 21st century, then I think we may well get it right. And in many respects, what we need to do intellectually and politically is to do exactly what the West did 300 years ago when it was born. And that was, number 1, be comfortable with the diffusion of power. from monarchs to normal people. And number two, be comfortable with religious, political, and ideological diversity. Because it was comfort with diversity that allowed Europe to find peace and to enjoy the benefits of the Industrial Revolution. As we see state capitalism rise, as we see political Islam spread, we should not fear it. In some ways, the trick is to recognize that it will be a part of the world that we live in and to channel it in the right direction. And if we do that, accept the diffusion of power, accept that we're heading toward political diversity, I think the 21st century will be one of the most prosperous and stable centuries we've ever lived in. If we get it wrong, it could well be a very dangerous and a very divided century. We need to get it right. Thank you very much. I welcome your questions and comments. There's a microphone right here and one here. Please. Not yet. There we go.
Okay, it's on now. A question for you. In your talk today, you didn't mention environment and natural resource factors, global population growth of over 7 billion. How would you factor in a view such as Lester Brown, who was the founder of the World Watch Institute and wrote World on the Edge? He was concerned that we aren't taking these factors into account, especially the ability of the land that's being degraded, the water's being degraded, and the inability of agricultural innovation to be able to feed. He argues destabilization. Would you comment on is he totally out to lunch in your view, or are these factors really important in looking at the overall equations you're putting forward?
I think it's a very important issue that you've raised, and it magnifies the challenges that we have before us. You know, I think that we have become somewhat complacent about order and about relations among great powers, and we have assumed that the real challenges of our time come from Yemen, Iraq, Libya. But I worry that history is picking up again, and that competition over water, over oil, over natural gas, over arable land is going to get more and more intense. As India and China continue to industrialize, they're going to need a lot of energy and they're going to need a lot of food. Where are they going to get it? That makes the sea lanes of communication all the more important. It makes access to land all the more important. And that's why I think we need to think now about how to create cooperative multilateral mechanisms to manage those issues. The Arctic. There was an article in the paper just the other day about the heating up of competition over minerals and sea lanes in the Arctic, because pretty soon there will be no ice in the summer. It's better to think about that now and to sit down with other countries and map out a way to manage that than to stick our heads in the sand. But that's one of the reasons that I think restoring our political solvency, getting our fundamental institutions of representative government back on their feet, is the first task. Once you do that, then you can go out and address these other issues. Please.
Thank you for your talk. You will see the future world as multipolar world. I wonder, how do you see U.S. national security and defense changing, or the notion of it changing in that world? Thank you.
Well, I think that historically speaking, we've been living in a world in which either the United Kingdom or the United States have been the global provider of security for a long time. They underwrite the open trade, they underwrite the internet. Before it used to be the telegraph, but this infrastructure of the global system has depended to some extent on there being hierarchy in the international system. And when you're in a world in which there is less hierarchy, then reaching agreement becomes more difficult. I'm someone who believes in American ideas and American ideals. I think those ideas and ideals have a great deal of traction and appeal around the world, but I also believe that the appeal of our ideas is very difficult to untangle from our power. And the American way has been very alluring, in part because it's attached to the dollar and to the aircraft carrier. And when we're in a world in which there are other countries out there, then I think it gets more complicated. That's why I think ideologically speaking, it's going to be a diverse world, not a world that follows one path. In terms of national security, I think the U.S. will remain, because of our military superiority, the main country that continues to provide what one could call public goods. We have 11 or 12 aircraft carriers. The Chinese have just floated a bathtub that they bought from the Ukrainians, and they're trying to figure out how to land an airplane on it. Right? It's going to be a long time before China comes anywhere near the United States as a global military power. But it's because of the importance of our ability to sustain this global infrastructure that I worry a lot about us avoiding the kinds of efforts to become the fixer of last resort. Right? When we get mired in Afghanistan, when we try to turn Iraq into a democracy, there are serious opportunity costs. The sort of punchline, I guess, would be we need to pick our shots much more carefully, because we have a huge first-order business managing a world in which power will be more equally distributed. Please.
Yeah. Bob Perillo, very interesting talk, sir.
Thank you.
But sort of to get some of the points that you were raising, the Egypt and Tunisia, the Middle East has essentially, they voted for against modernity, against commercialism, against an industrial society. If you look at the two people Morsi put, his appointments, I mean, the head of the Supreme Court, the head of the military, I mean, how can you build a society where they're not going to have 50% of the people working, okay? Where you're not going to educate them? How can you build a society where the general's now talking about half of the senior enlisted in the in Egyptian military? He's talking about throwing them out of the country, saying that they're not. I mean, then when you look at India, yes, you're right. But if you look at, you're talking about a very small percentage of the Indian population. If you look at, I mean, very little of the Indian population goes to IIT, okay? If you look at India, you're talking about 95% of the population is uneducated, and they're doing nothing to educate them. And if you look at China, you are right that they are trying to franchise their middle class, but they're not trying to take the peasants and bring them in the middle class.
Okay.
And so on those 3 points, I don't see what you're talking about. And other people, like Tom Friedman said, it's going to take like 75 years, he thinks, for the Middle East now to have a modern society.
Right. Those are all, I think, very, very good and valid points. I would just rephrase the first sentence, which you said that the Egyptians voted against modernity. I would say that the Egyptians voted for their own brand of modernity, and that what we're seeing in the Middle East is that voters would like to see more religion in politics. And in Turkey, I think we're seeing a country that is modernizing, its middle class is growing, it's wealthier, and its main party is an Islamist party that is trying to create a pluralist democratic society infused by Islamic values. That's what the people of Turkey want. I don't think it's our responsibility or obligation to tell them that they shouldn't want that. And I hope the Turkish model succeeds, because I think it would be a model for the rest of the region. And so that's part of why I think what we're witnessing is these different paths. Now, you're right to say that they have a lot of tasks ahead of them to build a prosperous society and to find jobs for people when the military owns about 50% of the country's wealth. But they are, starting down that path. India, you're right, they have a lot of work to do in educating their people and getting people out of poverty. But they will, within the next 15 years or so, have the world's largest labor force. Their population is going to cross China's sometime around 2025. And they, in some ways, not politically incorrect to put it this way, but one of the reasons they've lagged so far behind China is because of democracy. Their democratic institutions are much less efficient than China's command institutions, and China has therefore been able to do a better job of educating and employing its citizens. Again, the main point here is that there are these different models out here. They have strengths and weaknesses, and that's why I think in the 21st century we will do just fine, but our approach to organizing society, organizing markets, organizing governments will prove to be one, not the only one. Please.
Yes, here in this country, how well do you think we are educating, preparing the political class that will lead this nation in the next generation, the military leadership that will lead our military in the next generation, and the voting public for the world that you've outlined?
Well, I think that this story that I told about a global turn, I focused mainly on the flow of power and wealth to the developing world, but it's in a story here at home as well. And I think that it cannot be accidental that the United States, Europe, and Japan are all stumbling at the same time. And the reason I think that we are stumbling is because of globalization. Because 200+ billion workers have entered the global economy, and they have depressed the wages and in some cases taken the jobs of American workers and Japanese workers and European workers. And we now need to figure out American economy 2.0. What are American middle-class workers going to do in a world in which we are not going to be able to compete with China in building whatever they're building? And the answer is we've got to educate them to get those jobs, to kind of rebuild our middle class. There, I think we're failing. I think when it comes to the upper stratum of American society, we're doing very well. We have the best universities in the world. We have the most entrepreneurial spirit in the world. But there needs to be growth from the center out rather than from just the top. Doesn't trickle down as much as I think many people would like. And therefore, I think figuring out how to get our primary education system going again, figuring out where we should invest in our infrastructure, our research and development, these are critical steps to preparing the country, to preparing ordinary American voters for the big tasks that we have ahead of us. Andy.
Currently, there's a substantial investment among a lot of people in the country in the notion of American exceptionalism, that America is special. Some people think it's a God-given blessing. Other people just think it's a factor of history. And I have a perception that this notion of American exceptionalism, one, makes the people who will hold that less tolerant of diversity around the world, and two, less tolerant of diversity about ideas internally. And I think we can see that play out. We saw that play out in the Republican primary, where people developed parodies almost of a conservative agenda. And then lastly, American exceptionalism, I think, leads people to not want to say America has to compete in the world economy. We had, from the 1945 to the 1970s, We did not have to, we were the last industrial nation standing. So, and that's changed.
Right.
But there's a resistance to that. So
Right.
your sense about American exceptionalism.
I mean, I think that there is an exceptionalism to the United States that's rooted in our history, in our political culture, in our fierce individualism, but that it, in the political season, people tend to get carried away with it. And that, number one, American exceptionalism should not be an excuse for not dealing with problems. We can't hide behind American exceptionalism. We can acknowledge it, accept it, and then say, here are the things we need to do to fix our country. And secondly, precisely because we are exceptional and have followed a unique socioeconomic and cultural and political trajectory, I don't think that our model is going to be replicated around the world, right? And therefore, the idea that we are exceptional and therefore we will go out and recreate the world in America's image is a mistake. I think it should be, we have followed our own path. It's an exceptional one. It's a unique one in history. And now other countries are finding their own paths to modernity. That, to me, is the essential turn in the way we think about the world that we need to make to accept the diversity and the diffusion of power that I think is looming on the horizon. Please.
First, thank you very much for your comments. It's heartening to see that somebody is looking at seeing what's going on in the world. My question is this: what do you see as the future of the European Union, if any, or how do you see it changing in the next 10, 15, 20 years?
If we had had this conversation 10 years ago, I would have been very bullish about the European Union because I thought Europe was engaging in an experiment not unlike ours. That is to say, little by little, passing power from the separate sovereign states up to a federation or confederation that would turn Europe into something that enjoyed unity, not a federal state like we have, but something that was able to project its voice externally in the world and to be a credible partner of the United States. That hasn't happened. Europe has hit the skids. And I think that it's not just about the Euro crisis, it is about a renationalization of political life. Political life has dropped down from Brussels to Berlin, from Brussels to Paris, from Brussels to Rome, in a way that has made it very hard for the EU to thrive. And there is today an uneasy tension between the collective governance that Europe needs to thrive and the political street in Europe, which has become somewhat anti-European. I think they have turned the corner. I think they have found a formula for keeping Greece in, for allowing the euro to survive, and European leaders like Chancellor Merkel in Germany are starting to lead and talk about the importance of the European experiment, its revolutionary, historic importance. And so I'm getting bullish again. But if you were to say to me, what keeps me up at night, I still worry about a global financial crisis spreading outward because the Eurozone goes belly up. And if that happens, it's going to be ugly. I think we have run out of time. I apologize to the two or three people in line, but I'd be happy to answer your questions personally after the talk. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.